Good afternoon. Please be seated. I want to tell you about a telephone call I once received. The year was 1987, late autumn, I believe, and on the other end of the line was a publisher with what seemed like a perfectly reasonable request. They wanted a book about the French Revolution for the bicentenary in 1989. 2 years to write the history of the revolution. You may be thinking this sounds generous. 2 full years. But consider what they were actually asking. Not a slim volume, not an essay, a comprehensive narrative history of one of the most documented, debated, analyzed periods in human history. The Terror, the fall of the Bastille, Robespierre, the September massacres, the death of a king. 200 years of scholarship, argument, and interpretation. And they wanted it fresh, original, and ready for the bicentennial celebrations. I had long wanted to write about the French Revolution. What historian hasn't? But I imagined it as something you did later in your career, after decades of preparation, when you had read everything, thought through everything, when you were ready. This was different. This was writing at speed, writing against the calendar itself. I said yes. Now, why am I telling you this story? Not to recount my publishing history, I assure you. I want us to explore together a paradox that lives at the heart of intellectual work, a mystery that most academics spend their entire careers either embracing or fleeing from: the relationship between time pressure and the quality of thinking. Let us begin with a common assumption. Picture the ideal conditions for writing a great work of history. What do you see? I suspect you imagine something like this: a scholar in a book-lined study, years stretching ahead, unlimited time to research, to reflect, to refine. No deadlines, no publisher breathing down the neck, just pure, undisturbed contemplation. This is the romantic image of scholarship, and it is, in most cases, a lie. Or rather, it is a partial truth that hides a more interesting reality. Because here is what I discovered while writing Citizens in those frantic months before 1889. Deadlines do not merely constrain thinking, they can sharpen it. Let me show you what I mean. When you have unlimited time, something curious happens to the mind. Every question opens 10 more questions. Every source demands another source. Every argument reveals another complexity that must be addressed. The work expands to fill whatever time you give it. This is Parkinson's law applied to scholarship. And expansion, while it sounds like depth, can become its opposite. It can become paralysis. I do not mean that careful research is worthless. Far from it. But there is a difference between thoroughness and perpetual deferral. The scholar who waits until they have read everything will never write anything, because there is always one more archive, one more interpretation, one more footnote to chase down. The deadline forces a different kind of discipline. It asks, what is essential? What truly matters in this story? When I sat down to write Citizens, I knew I could not read every book on the French Revolution. There were thousands. I could not visit every archive. They would take lifetimes. I had to make choices. And those choices, forced by time, actually clarified my thinking rather than muddying it. I had to ask myself, what is my argument? Not just what happened in the revolution, but what I believed about what happened. What pattern was I seeing that others had missed? What story needed telling? This is where speed becomes an unlikely ally. When you cannot hide behind endless research, when you cannot defer the moment of commitment to a thesis, you must think clearly about what you actually believe. The deadline strips away the comfortable fog of, I'll figure that out later. Think of it this way. Imagine you are a portrait painter, and I give you unlimited time to paint someone's face. You could spend years on the eyes alone, capturing every subtle variation of color, every tiny reflection. But at some point, those eyes must exist in relation to a nose, a mouth, a composition. The painting requires decisions. It requires you to say, this is the essence of this face, not every possible detail, but the truth I see. Historical writing is no different. You are painting in words, and the canvas has edges. The deadline defines those edges. Now, I must be clear about what I am not saying. I am not advocating for rushed work or sloppy research. Citizens was not thrown together carelessly. Even at speed, I read voraciously. I traveled to Paris, walked the streets where the revolution unfolded. I immersed myself in the primary sources, the pamphlets, the speeches, the eyewitness accounts. But I did all of this with focus, with purpose, with the bicentenary counting down in the background like a ticking clock. And here is what happened. The pressure created momentum. Each day's writing built on the previous day. The narrative gained velocity. I found myself making connections I might have second guessed into oblivion if I'd had more time. I trusted my instincts. I followed the story where it wanted to go. You might ask, but surely this produced a lesser book than you would have written with more time. The book won the NCR Book Award. More importantly, and this is what truly surprised me, it brought the revolution alive for readers in a way that many more scholarly, careful works had not. People read it. They argued with it. They felt the terror and the hope and the chaos of those years. The urgency in the writing matched the urgency of the events themselves. I learned something about myself during those months of furious writing, that I could work under the kind of commercial and temporal pressures that most academic historians avoided, that there was value in writing for both specialists and general readers simultaneously, that narrative history could be written with passion without sacrificing intellectual rigor. But I learned something larger, too, something about the nature of historical understanding itself. History is not a jigsaw puzzle with one correct solution, waiting patiently for us to find all the pieces. It is an argument we make with the past, a story we tell about evidence that could support multiple stories. And arguments, like stories, require decisiveness. They require the writer to commit, to say, this is how I see it. This is what I believe happened and why it matters. The deadline forced that commitment out of me. It asked me to trust that I knew enough, had thought deeply enough, had something worth saying. And in that trust, I found a kind of freedom. Let me take us back to that telephone call in 1987. When the publisher asked for the book, I could have said no. I could have said I needed 5 years, 10 years, that I wasn't ready. Many scholars would have, and they would have been perfectly justified. Writing serious history takes time. But I said yes. And in saying yes, I accepted a challenge that would change how I thought about my work. I accepted that sometimes you must write into uncertainty, that you must begin before you feel ready, that the act of writing itself can be a form of thinking, not just a reporting of thinking already done. This is perhaps the deepest lesson. We imagine that we first understand something fully, and then we write it down. But often, the reverse is true. We write in order to understand. We discover what we think by trying to articulate it. The deadline makes this process visible, urgent, undeniable. When 1989 arrived and citizens appeared in bookstores, the bicentennial celebrations were in full swing. The book became part of a larger conversation about what the revolution meant, what it had accomplished, what it had destroyed. I remember walking through Paris that summer, seeing commemorative posters and exhibits everywhere, knowing that my interpretation of those events was now out in the world, subject to critique and debate. There was something fitting about that. The revolution itself was an event of tremendous speed and urgency, decisions made in hours that would echo for centuries. To write about it slowly, carefully, academically, might miss something essential about its character. Perhaps writing at speed allowed me to capture something of that revolutionary momentum. I do not recommend this approach for every book. Some works truly do require years of patient accumulation. But I wonder how many books remain unwritten because scholars are waiting for the perfect conditions that will never arrive. How many important arguments go unmade because the thinker does not feel quite ready yet? The deadline, in this sense, is a gift. It tells you the time is now. You know enough. Begin. And when you begin, when you commit to the page, despite uncertainty, you often discover that you knew more than you thought you did, that the years of reading and thinking and observing have prepared you in ways you could not articulate until you tried to write. Ladies and gentlemen, let me leave you with this thought. We live in an age that celebrates perfectionism, that tells us to wait until conditions are ideal, until we are truly ready. But some of the most vital work in history, in art, in any field that requires both rigor and imagination emerges from the productive tension between what we know and the pressure to say it now. The publisher's commission, the bicentenary deadline, the ticking clock, these were not obstacles to writing citizens. They were the very conditions that made it possible. Speed can sharpen, pressure can clarify, urgency can be an ally to truth. This is what I learned while racing against 1789's 200th anniversary. And I learned it only because I had no choice but to begin.